Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and today for the first time in 2 years I'm going to be updating my tier list of every single tier 10 tank. A lot has changed in the game since 2019. We have field mods, we have equipment 2.0, and it's revolutionized the way that you can play some of the tier 10 vehicles. Some tanks have been buffed, some tanks have been borderline replaced by other new vehicles, and so I'm going to be giving you my full opinion of every tier 10 tank that I have inside my garage. But I'd like to add the caveat that this is my list. It's undoubtable that maybe your nan or your dog might feel differently about these individual tanks, and maybe they can make them work a little bit better than I can. So without further ado, let's jump in. But be warned, this is likely to be a long one, but you're going to be getting tens of thousands of games of experience in an hour-long format. So maybe you want to go and grab yourself a drink and take notes. So firstly, let's talk about the 113. This vehicle is a collector's tank that you can't access inside a tech tree, but you can purchase it for 6 million credits after you've unlocked, I think, a tier 10 Chinese heavy. The 113 was removed because I guess it wasn't exciting like the vehicle we're going to be talking about next. This vehicle is like so many other tanks in the game with 440 alpha damage and decent frontal armor. The reason why I don't enjoy this thing very much is because it only has 5 degrees of gun depression over the front, and you have to turn the vehicle pretty much to the side, exposing more of your vulnerable bits to be able to get that extra 7 degrees of armor. I just think there are better heavy tanks going into the game left, right, and center, and so I'm going to put this thing in the alright or situational section, but is it worth the 6 million credits? Probably not. Unless you're planning on going for the Chinese medium tank, the tier 9 tech tree vehicle, the WZ-120. And that is because the gun on the WZ-120 is the same as the gun on the 113. And so if you can bring yourself to part with 6 million credits, you can actually save yourself having to research 59,000 experience with some very uncompetitive guns on the tank. So yeah, if you have tons of credits with your premium tanks and you don't want to spend the free XP, I guess there's still a reason to enjoy the 113. Next up, let's be talking about the WZ-111-5A. I personally still really enjoy this tank with its great aim time, good gun handling, 7 degrees of all-round gun depression, and decent speed limit. Previously, I would have put this thing up in the super competitive section, but I'm thinking I'm going to have to drop it down into the great performers or decent choices just because time has moved on for the last 2 years, and I think there are probably better tanks than you can be able to get your hands on. But this thing is still a great performer in World of Tanks, at least in my opinion. How can you go wrong with decent DPM, all of the gun depression, enough armor to be able to just make real low tier tanks look absolutely useless? This thing for me, I rate it much higher than the 113 for just its flexibility, especially with the depression over the front. While I think it could flip-flop between these two sections, I'm going to just leave it in the great performers because whenever I get in this tank and I just play aggressive, it seems to work out for me. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, one of the new tier 10 tanks since I did this video a couple of years ago. This is the VZ-55. And I'm going to be jumping it straight up into the godlike section. And that is because the vehicle is outperforming pretty much every other tier 10 heavy tank across the board, be it damage, be it win ratio, be it amount of the kills that it gets inside the game. And that is because this thing deals 980 damage in 2 seconds of the first shot. And its DPM isn't even bad. The thing's armor is really good as well. I have been trolled so many times shooting at this thing. It's well angled, compact armor, space protection over the side of the turret, which is usually a weakness for most vehicles. It's just kind of the all-round assault heavy tank, and it's just so in tune with the current meta of World of Tanks, which is enough speed and enough armor, and also to be able to deliver that 1-2 punch. It just seems to work out really well. If there's one thing that I don't like about this tank, it would have to be the premium penetration, but that doesn't seem to be really affecting the vehicle's popularity or indeed its impact inside the game. When the VZ-55 first came out several months ago, I was kind of still wanting to hold back my full opinion about the vehicle where I thought it was outrageous. And while I don't think that it's completely and utterly broken, and I think that the more that the average players are picking up this tank, the all-round performance of the vehicle is going to continue to drop down, it's still an absolute god-tier performer inside World of Tanks. All right, next up I'm going to be talking about the AMX 50B. This vehicle, I believe, in the last couple of years has received some significant buffs. it's a decent damage dealer with mobility to be able to get around, with hull armor at least at the front that can try and troll some players. And considering Equipment 2.0 really pumped up the performance of a vehicle like this, you can even set it up with some speed. I'm a bit of an idiot. I decided to put a spowl liner on this thing and get rid of the med kit so I can use fuel instead to be able to amplify its already great top speed limit and its engine power. It results in the vehicle being very strong indeed. I think the problem with the tank is that there are other vehicles that have also been significantly buffed as well. And so it's a toss-up for me whether I want to put this in the alright and situational and decent choices, purely because you can kind of get the flavor of this tank on so many other vehicles. And while this one will undoubtedly be the faster, I could never even bring myself to think about playing this thing in ranked unless I seriously wanted to sit on the red line. Alright, next up, let's talk about the AMX M4 54. This tank is right down towards the I hate it or the avoid section. And the reason for that is because its previous tank, the AMX M4 51, is actually one of the best heavy tanks tier for tier in the game. And you make this jump up to tier 10 and you just don't really get the benefit from it. Your gun stays the same, your armor, it gets a little bit better, but to all intents and purposes, it really stays the same, especially from a tier for tier perspective. But of course, you're no longer meeting those juicy tier 7s and you're always meeting that all tier 10 matchup. This thing, while it can do well, I would strongly recommend that you avoid even getting this tier 10 in the first place. I'm even going to put it in the I hate it section because whenever I play this tank, I despise my gameplay. Next up, let's talk about our first of the 3 German heavy tanks. It is the Panzer VII. I really do not enjoy this vehicle, but I have to admit that in the right situation, it can actually be pretty darn good. The real problem with the Panzer VII is the way that the vehicle's armor works out. While it will do incredibly well in this kind of a situation against, your standard ammunition, who's even firing regular rounds at tier 7 anymore? Most people are firing gold, and then your lower plate becomes a bit of a weak point. And then the issue is that you could say, oh, well, QB, why don't you side scrape round a corner? But even if you're side scraping around a corner in this kind of a situation, then you have this huge triangle that every decent player will know exactly how to deal with. For that, it feels that I would strongly recommend avoiding playing this tank, especially for the experienced players out there, because it will frustrate the living daylights out of you. However, it's not fair of me to put it in the avoid section. I'm going to have to put it in the alright and situational section because this tank, at least in some scenarios, can still be very good when you get those kind of magical muppets that don't know about its weak points, or maybe just your really good matchups. But let's be honest, all of the other vehicles are going to do well in those nice matchups as well. Now, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, this is the heaviest tank in the game. It's the one, it's the only, it's the original tier 10 German heavy tank. It's the Maus. Now, some players this kind of tank's like Marmite, all right? You either love it or you hate it. Some players would put it into the avoid section, and some players would want to put it in the godlike section. I don't think either is kind of fair in this scenario. I genuinely think that not putting the Maus in the super competitive or the great performance section, especially with Equipment 2.0, would be a crime against German heavies. And in fact, a lot of you might be very surprised to hear that the Maus actually has the 4th best win ratio of any of the tier 10 heavy tanks that are available inside the tech tree. The Maus, while it's limited by its speed, which you can improve with the turbo, which I think is the most important piece of equipment to use on this tank, it is arguably the highest skill cap armor usage in the game because you're constantly having to re-evaluate what the threat is and to angle your armor towards it to be able to mitigate it. And while sure, people are going to load gold as they should do and try and aim at the flat surfaces of the vehicle, I'm going to be dumping the Maus in the super competitive section because if you know how to play this thing, and especially if you end up in a platoon with one of these, what you can do with 3,500 hit points and just enough weight to be able to throw around, driving around up to 27 kilometers an hour, this thing in the right hands is an incredibly good tank. But here's what's also important. Every time I play this tank, I have fun. And at the end of the day, while we can look at this tier list from a competitive standing point, it is also about having fun inside World of Tanks. And for that, the Maus is the best tank in the game. I'm not the kind of person who would probably want to play the mouse 10 times in a row for just throwing it into a play session, going in and playing crazy and seeing whether it works out for you. There's no other tank that can feel quite like the mouse from that perspective. Now we're going to be talking about the E100. This is my first tier 10 heavy tank, and it recently had a substantial buff to its smaller caliber gun, the 128mm. Statistically, the E100 is performing pretty darn well in the game, and I'm going to drop it, I believe, in the decent choices section. And here's the thing. If you use the smaller caliber gun on this tank, you're kind of better with the vehicle because you have the DPM to be able to deal with your threats, and it becomes this pseudo super heavy, pseudo regular kind of heavy tank. But it just doesn't feel as if you're playing a German heavy. It doesn't feel as if you're playing a mouse. Its playstyle, at least for me, feels so similar to a variety of other heavy tanks inside the game, and while it's still my original tier 10 heavy, its armor doesn't hold up to gold rounds like a lot of other heavy tanks do that are inside the game. And so I'm going to be dropping it in the decent choices. When it comes to which gun you should use on this tank, I still think the 128mm is best, but with the new intuition skill going in, it has definitely added to the argument of using the 150mm caliber gun because you can switch out the correct round quickly for the correct job. Now let's talk about the Rinoceronte. And even though this vehicle is one of the newer tanks, its win ratio keeps dropping and dropping and dropping. And the reason for that, of course, is that when a tank first comes out, all of the more sweaty, experienced players are going to either grind towards it or they're going to have all of the experience waiting to be able to get the tank on day one. And so the kind of players who play the tank initially are the best players, well, the better players, I should say, inside the game. Then eventually, all of the more casual players catch up and the win ratio of the vehicle will dip down. This is what is happening currently as well with the VZ-55, and it happens with every tank inside the game. The Rinoceronte, with this kind of slippery slope down, is kind of proving the idea that I originally had about this tank. And that is that Wargaming just released it in a less than competitive point with regard to its statistics. Now look, the Rinoceronte, it can still do well, but the problem with the vehicle is its damage per minute is just too low for the current meta of the game. And while all of the other statistics of the tank, they're okay, and across the board, if it had a few little better areas, it could actually be a very competitive and also, I'd say, fun tank to play. The issue is that whenever I play this vehicle, I feel like I'm constantly having to make the better of two bad decisions about, do I fire all my ammunition now and actually do some damage, but then I'm out of the game for pretty much another 50 seconds to be able to reload, and you make your terrible DPM even worse the deeper that you go into the mag. And while on a vehicle like the Batchat or even the Progetto 66, it feels as if it's a choice that you can kind of make. The Rinoceronte, the fact that its DPM steps down from tier 9 and has the same at tier 8, it just doesn't work at tier 10. This vehicle needs to have a rate of fire buff because it's just not quite working out. But there's a fine line between buffing the Rinoceronte and making it end up something like a VZ-55, and we don't need to have overpowered autoloaders, or at least any more of them, running around the game. The problem for the Rinoceronte is that there are competitive autoloaders running around in the game, and this is not one of them. And so I'm going to put the Rinoceronte either in the avoid or the alright and situational section. I'm going to put it in the alright and situational section because, for me at least, I love the auto-reloaded gameplay, and it just feels as if it can really challenge your mind to constantly have to try and make the right decisions. And for that, I really enjoy the tank. But there are other times when I'm literally just seeing that some bad luck and a miss means that I'm going to lose the game now, and I've passed the point where I can possibly be able to recover it, and I absolutely hate it. I'm going to drop it in the alright situational section. I would think that Wargaming are going to buff this vehicle maybe a little bit, at least soon, but I'm also wondering what Wargaming do and what Wargaming don't do sometimes feels as unpredictable as the British weather, which actually, when you think about it, is pretty predictable, especially this time of year, as it's always miserable. All right, now let's talk about the Type 5 Heavy. I'm sure that some people are going to want to put this in the avoid and the I hate it section, but honestly, this vehicle, if you get intuition and use the derpy gun on it, is kind of more in the middle of this tier list. The Type 5 Heavy is one of those kind of tanks that is underestimated by its opponents, and as soon as you start hitting them for 600-700, or you're able to penetrate some high explosive rounds, which you can quickly switch to with intuition, then you're doing 900 damage a pop, and you've still got kind of mouse tier hit points and enough armor to be able to brush aside the lower tier tanks. This tank is not as consistent as the mouse. If I'm playing in a tier 10 game in a mouse, I feel like I'm going to be much better. The Type 5 Heavy, on the other hand, when you get to play against tier 8 and tier 9 tanks, is an absolute brute. Nevertheless, considering that the vast majority of players are probably going to look at this list as to thinking about, where should I try and get the tank? I'm going to have to put it in the avoid section, even though personally for me, I would probably want to dump it up into the alright and situational section, because with the amount of credits that everyone's getting, it just feels as if all of the rounds that are fired in the game these days are gold, and they should be against a tank like this, because otherwise its armor is going to just laugh at you all day. Now let's talk about the 60 TP. I love this tank. I love it. I love it. It's the vehicle that allowed me to be able to get gold on my free-to-play account while firing less than 10 premium rounds and using no premium consumables. Although, I must add, this was before the high explosive nerfs, and I definitely loved clubbing all of the godlike super competitive Ridgeline tanks for 300 or 400. You can't do that anymore. Otherwise, I would be putting this up in the godlike section. For me, it's going to be a toss-up between either the great performance or the super competitive section, depending on what kind of a player you are. And I personally want to put it into the super competitive section, because honestly, it's like an E100, but just for the modern version of the game. The vehicle does have its issues, however, the fact that its top can be overmatched by large caliber guns, the fact that it has a bit of a weak point when you're side scraping with the tank. But I love this vehicle, and it has some of my best statistics both on my main account and on my free-to-play account. And if you know what you're doing in World of Tanks, you're going to do well in this tank. All right, now let's talk about the Kranvagn. This is a god-like tank. That's all there is to say. It's an incredible performer. If you can't play the Kranvagn well, then you are not a good player. I personally think that the Kranvagn is actually better than the VZ-55, at least for me in my playstyle, and I would far rather play the Kranvagn in something like Ranked than play a VZ-55, although there's no doubt the VZ-55 is a competitive vehicle as well, that at least statistically is outperforming the Kranvagn, but I would argue it's probably because that vehicle is still fresher and a lot of better players are still playing the tank. The Kranvagn versus the VZ-55. Which one is the better tank? I think that with the 4 degrees of extra gun depression that the Kranvagn has, the lack of the weak point that the tank has at the top, even though it does still have cupolas that are shootable, and the fact that this thing scales so well with cruise skill to up the vehicle's slow speed, especially if you get a Bond turbo on this tank. And it is just an insane tank. I render my opponents just completely obsolete, and I'm so much more flexible than they are on the Ridgeline. This tank is absolutely amazing, and for me personally, I prefer it to the VZ-55. But also, I understand there are players out there that just want to rumble into a position and then clap out that 980 damage far faster than the Kranvagn can even deliver 880. All right, so now let's talk about the FV215B, and I'm going to immediately dump this into the avoid section. I don't hate this tank. It's the kind of tank that gets underestimated, and I can still do well in it. I had a play session, I think a month or so ago, where I put some good equipment on this tank. Its DPM was outrageous, and while it does have huge weak points on the side when you side scrape, its lower plate is awful and it gets set on fire constantly. It can still do well, but only if you're a good player who knows what they're doing with the tank. It has, unsurprisingly, the lowest win ratio in the last 30 days on the European server, and not just by a little, 43.46% average. This tank might as well not even really be in the game with regards to being competitive, at least when you look at put it across the entire player base. And while I would thoroughly recommend you avoid it, it's not worth purchasing. I can't put this thing into the I hate it section because I don't hate it. I tell you, another tank that I don't hate as well, the Super Conqueror. This is just an FV215B that doesn't suck. And as it's a tier 10 British heavy tank that has 10 degrees of gun depression, and the fact that artillery has been nerfed in the game so much that you don't even have to worry about them on the ridgeline, it's a toss-up as to whether this thing goes in the godlike to the great performers section. I'm going to dump it in the super competitive section. This tank on a ridgeline is an absolute beast. It also has god tier DPM, and with intuition, how many times am I going to say that in this video? Its high explosive rounds are more relevant than ever. 515 alpha damage and 120 millimeters of penetration goes a long way when you're engaging lightly armored targets, and that will out DPM even a Badger that is firing, albeit standard ammunition. All of this combined with the fact that the field mods have allowed the Super Conqueror to go faster than ever before and have enough view range that it doesn't need to use coated optics. And there's no doubt why it is outperforming most of the other heavy tanks inside the game. All right, so those were all of the heavy tanks. Now let's move on to the tank destroyers. Now let's talk about the T57 Heavy. I'm going to have to drop this thing into the avoid section, even though it pains me to do so. And that's because I actually kind of enjoy the playstyle of this tank. And from a damage and kills perspective, I average well with the vehicle. The problem with the tank is that it has to play against a Kranvagn, it has to play against a VZ-55, and when that happens, they can pen you in the turret and you can't pen them in the turret reliably. And to be able to get into that magic situation where you rush in and you dump your 4 rounds in and then you reload before even the VZ-55 can reload its 2 shells, just doesn't really happen because quite often they're not isolated, they have support, and this thing just doesn't get into those 1 versus 1 situations where it can really decimate its opponents and then last up for long enough to be able to go at them again. I personally really enjoy playing this tank. It's a real fun one to take out and just have a I don't care, we're gonna fight, and hopefully I'm gonna take you down before you take me down. But it would be unfair of me to put this up the list and any of you to go out and actually get it and then realize that it's just awful because all of the other auto-loading heavy tanks are just outperforming it in the meta. Now let's talk about the T110E5. This is a vehicle that, again, it's not performing statistically, but I think that's because people just don't know how to play. I'm going to put the T110E5 personally in either the decent choices or the alright situational section. For the casual players out there, I wouldn't recommend actually getting this tank, however. But for the average and the experienced players out there who are actually looking at something that is possibly underrated, I would actually take a look at this tank. So I'm going to dump it in the decent choices, honestly, because how can you go wrong with its all-round combat potential? This thing is like a renegade. Sure, it has a weak point on top, but look at all of the other tank statistics that you can manage to make work. Obviously, a lot of people are going to think about the Super Conqueror versus the T110E5. And when we're thinking about just sitting there on a ridgeline and being super competitive at that scenario, there's absolutely no doubt that the Super Conqueror is the better tank. That's why it's ending up in the super competitive section. However, I'm talking about the random queue for the most part. While I would never use the T110E5 in ranked, inside the random queue, other things happen. Like occasionally an artillery shell hits you, occasionally a high explosive shell hits you, and the T110E5 will take that way better than a Super Conqueror will, unless they're hitting right in the front on the space protection. And the top armor on the E5 feels way better than the Super Conqueror. It feels like a more compact tank, and I love the side armor of the T110E5, which is actually very well angled and kind of boat shaped. So you can actually over angle this tank a lot like you can on an M48 A5 Patton, and you will often be catching a magical ricochet. Sure, it has a lower plate that's an issue. Sure, it has a weak point on top. Play like a renegade. Go sideways on a ridgeline, use your 8 degrees of gun depression, and then go backwards and forwards to be able to make that weak point a hard thing to hit, and then just overpower your opponents with the DPM. And if there's one thing I really like about the T110E5, it's that it can play like a Super Conqueror, kind of on a ridge, but it has the armor to be able to make these aggressive plays against tier 8 and tier 9 tanks that the Super Conqueror can only dream of. Now let's talk about the Object 260. This vehicle is fast, it's furious, it is an outrageous machine inside World of Tanks. The only problem for the Object 260 is that while it's definitely benefited from the field mods and your ability to be able to use a wider variety of equipment with Equipment 2.0, it just hasn't received the kind of buffs that a lot of the other tanks have, and also like some of the other super competitive god tanks are. The 260 would have been better previously in the artillery matchups than it is now. Unlike your VZ-55 and your Kranvagn and your Super Conqueror that all want to sit on a ridgeline and just tank the enemy's shells and hopefully avoid the artillery, the 260 on the other hand would have done way better because it would have rushed into a safe position to avoid the artillery, to set up a line fire and be able to spot from there. I just think that its meta position, I would no longer put it in a kind of a godlike section. I'd drop it into a super competitive section, however. It's definitely suffered from the artillery nerfs more than a lot of the other tanks. Nevertheless, you can get this thing up to near 70 kilometers an hour with the field mods, and it can be arguably the fastest heavy tank in the game along with the AMX 50B. And for that, that is still one of the best reward vehicles. Now let's talk about the Object 705A. I want to dump this thing in the alright, situational, decent choices section. It's a tough one. It's amazing at side scraping. From that perspective, I'll put it up in the godlike section, but its gun is just really not consistent, and its armor, while it's good, it's not incredible. I think, personally, considering the holistic nature of the tank and the fact that when you are in those scenarios, it is impenetrable, and the fact that artillery has been nerfed so much, I'm going to dump it in the decent choices section. You can't go too wrong. All right, now let's talk about the 277. This vehicle originally was up in the echelons of the competitive section. However, I feel that just like with the 260, the game has become so much more about being stuck on a ridgeline. And this vehicle with its 5.5 degrees of gun depression, I think, has suffered from that regard. Accordingly, I think it's a toss-up between a great performers and a decent choices section. And I think considering that it's basically the Soviet version of the WZ-111-5A, that it will be joining its brother there. Okay, so now let's talk about the 279E. This thing for me is going straight up to godlike, but also it should also go into the I hate it section. Do you know why? Because I feel like a tourist whenever I play this tank. I honestly feel as if I'm distanced. I'm not really concerned about the situation that much, and I just drive around and destroy things. Now that sounds like a fun thing for a lot of players, right? However, I will say that it's an incredibly depressing tank to play because there's no sense of adventure, there's no sense of concern. It's the kind of tank that when you just sit in front of your opponents, at first you kind of have a laugh, you kind of have a giggle at the fact that they can't manage to pen you. And then after a while it just becomes, yeah, they can't pen me because my tank is overpowered. And you don't have that sense of danger, you don't have that sense of death that really can be quite exciting in World of Tanks. The 279E has the best win ratio of any heavy tank, reward or not, inside the game. Better than the win ratio on the Chieftain, for example. Although you could argue that it's harder to get the 279E for some players than it is to become good inside the Clan Wars perspective. And so maybe there's still a bit of a skill gate towards getting the 279E as to why its win ratio would be up there. But really, I think it's just because when you create a tank that doesn't have a lower plate, which, let's be honest, is the go-to I pen you for most players when they're engaging tanks, I'm still going to be throwing this thing up into the godlike section. All right, now let's talk about the ST2. I really like this tank. I think it's super fun, although from a win ratio perspective, it's got the same as the AMX M4 54. But I actually really enjoy the vehicle. I think it's fabulous to have that flexible double-barrel gun where you can deliver that 880 alpha damage. Or alternatively, you can just reload one by one and kind of grind down your opponents, a bit like an auto-reloader, because it is one, or like an Italian auto-reloader, I should say, but just without that shell compensation, and then be able to go in. I love it. I love this tank. I want to put this in two different places. All right, if you're a casual player and you don't really feel comfortable with your double-barrel tanks and you think it is going to be too confusing, I'm going to dump it in the alright and situational section. However, for the real good players out there, this thing is a bit of a hidden gem, and I would put it either in the great performers or the decent choices section. I feel like great performers, I'm not sure I can kind of squeeze it up there. I want to. And you know what? This is my list, so I'm going to dump the ST2 there. This is a real fun tank. I love its playstyle. And once again, Equipment 2.0 really helped this vehicle. I personally like to use vents, a turbo, and a rotation device. Sounds weird, right? Not using vertical stabilizers on an autoloader. But honestly, I would trade, and by the way, I'm talking about Bounty rotation device. I would trade the extra 10% gun handling comparing Bounty vertical stabilizers, which is 25%, and Bounty rotation device, which is 15%, to be able to gain that whole extra 15% traverse speed. Because this vehicle, its side armor, especially with its turret and being able to re-engage the targets, is not very good. And another reason why the vertical stabilizers are probably not so mandatory on this tank is that it has incredible turret traverse dispersion. And the rotation device will just allow you to be able to get your gun on target quicker to be able to deliver those double shots. All right, now let's talk about the IS-7. This tank is really interesting because it really divides the player base. Okay, here's the thing. If you're an awful player, you will love the IS-7. Why? Because you'll hold down your W key and you'll go and hold down in a position, or you'll face hug your opponents and you'll go, hew, 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 I did 1,500 damage. Okay. Then there's kind of like the below average players who kind of know what they're doing. The average players and the above average players who will get incredibly frustrated about the IS-7 because they'll be thinking too much once again. They're not really going to realize that what those terrible players were doing was kind of almost the right thing. And they're going to take too long. They're going to try and make trades. They're going to try and play it too sensibly. And it's not really going to work out for them. And then there are the excellent players who know how to use all of the armor and the statistics of the IS-7, where once again, it's going to end up into the real competitive areas of this list, which kind of makes this tank hilarious because its win ratio is just 47.72 average on the European server in the last 30 days. That's just because people just don't know how to play this vehicle. And so for me personally, I want to put this thing in the great performers section. While there are undoubtedly other more competitive heavy tanks inside the game, if you can't play this thing, maybe you just need to relax a little bit, get some fast equipment on it, and really try and pressure your opponents. All right, now let's talk about the IS-4. This thing has been buffed significantly since I last did this list, but even with the buffs, it just doesn't really feel like it holds up. I'm going to put this thing in either in the decent choices or the alright and situational section. Probably put it in the alright and situational section because I feel like this is a tank that once again does much better inside a nice matchup than it does inside a more casual matchup. And I just think that there are better, more exciting tanks like the ST2 that you could grind towards where you've got a double barrel gun rather than going up this kind of mediocre Soviet tech tree. All right, so that was all of the heavy tanks. Now let's move on to the mediums. Okay, so firstly, let's talk about the 121. Recently been buffed, but is it a great tank? I personally want to put this in the avoid section, but even I have to admit that if you're playing it well, it can still be okay. I wouldn't want to put it up in the super competitive section, that's for sure. I'm going to put it in alright or situational, but I'm going to add a caveat in here that I would love to actually put this in the avoid section. Do you know why? Because its statistics are pretty good across the board. You know, it has some armor, it has some turret armor, it has a gun with 440 alpha damage, it's got good heat pen, it can club its opponents, its damage per minute is not too bad either. But whenever I play this tank, I just get bored. I don't enjoy the gun depression, I don't enjoy its mediocre mobility and its camo rating to prevent me from making aggressive plays. And unlike a 430U where you can definitely get away with playing like an absolute loon, yeah, the 121's hull armor definitely can't get away with that, especially when they're firing high explosive anti-tank rounds. So I would thoroughly recommend to go for other vehicles rather than this one, at least in my opinion. Now let's talk about the 121B. This is pretty much just a 121 that kind of feels as if it's a better tank. And it's a tank that Wargaming seem to just be able to buff and buff and buff, but it doesn't really get any better inside the game anyway. And I think that's just because it's really boring. Who wants to play a tank with 5 degrees of gun depression that has a reasonable amount of armor and doesn't have any kind of mobility and just wants to sit there and just go, okay, I'm going to shoot at you on a ridgeline with my 350 millimeters of high explosive anti-tank rounds? There's no doubt it's a good tank. And if you're a great player and you can be willing to sit there and play, at least in my opinion, a very boring playstyle, you're going to do very well in this tank. But for me, I'm going to have to drop it into a decent choices section. If you could buy it for credits. But you can't. You can't buy it for credits. You've got to buy it for bonds. And in my opinion, just having to actually spend bonds to get something that has such an awful, boring playstyle makes me want to drop it into the I hate it section. But I also think that is not fair on the 121, and I'm going to have to put it in the decent choices purely because statistically it's a very competitive tank. Next up, I want to talk about the TVP. I love this tank. It's fun, it's exciting, it's fast, it's got good DPM, it's got a real fun magazine that you can deliver 1,280 damage in 4.5 seconds of the first shot with 4 shots delivered. It's a savage tank, and if you're a very good player, this is definitely going to end up in the super competitive or the great performer section. If you're not, it's probably going to end up more in the decent choices or the alright and situational section. For me personally, I want to dump this thing in the great performers, but from a fun perspective, it's definitely got to go up a little bit more. Now let's talk about one of the original tier 10 medium tanks in the game. It's the Batchat T57. And no matter how long the game goes on and how old the Batchat gets, this thing just seems to remain inside the game. And in a competitive fashion as well. I personally would want to put it into the decent choices section rather than the great performers because I feel like the TVP just feels a little bit more meta. However, with Equipment 2.0, it's definitely managed to make the Batchat a great choice as well. You can have 2 setups on the Batchat. You can have a combat setup where maybe you're using vents, rotation device, and vertical stabilizers. And also with the field mods, you can improve the aim time and the dispersion after firing, which means that you can actually deliver your rounds better than ever before. But you can also have a second setup for when you want to play as a light tank. You could boost the camo, you could boost the view range, you could boost the crew skills. You could use a commander's vision system on this tank for when you get on Prokhorovka or Malinovka. There's so much flexibility as to what you can do with this tank. And so for a very good player who wants to play something which has untold carry potential and untold customization, I think those kind of players are going to really enjoy the Batchat. But I think that the casual players are probably going to end up not setting it up correctly and end up quite frustrated with this tank. Nevertheless, I still want to put it in the decent choices. Next up, AMX 30B. I hate this. That's all there is to say. Despise this tank. Huge weak point on top. So irrelevant that they decided to make it a collector's tank and to take it out the game. And to cap it all off, it has one of the worst win ratios of any of the tier 10 medium tanks. It's just such a boring playstyle as well. And considering that they buffed the German tank that this thing was competing with, there's no point of playing this thing. So I would thoroughly recommend either to avoid this thing, but I'm going to be putting this in the I hate it section. Because unlike the other tanks which I've put into the avoid section, this thing just doesn't have any fun playstyle. Alright, so E50M. E50M is weak and all of that. I should put it in the I hate it section. Oh, hell no. With all of the field mods and all of the customization you can have on this tank, I've had more fun ramming and just being hilarious in this tank. I can't believe I'm going to admit this on YouTube, but I'm starting to actually enjoy the anime girls because it just does the whole package on this tank for me. It's just this absolute meme in itself, which I'm proud that I added to all of those years ago. From that perspective, I want to drop the E50M in the godlike section, at least for fun, but that wouldn't be fair. I think that it's either got to go in the great performers or the decent choices section. I can't believe I'm doing this. I'm going to put it in the great performers section because honestly, if you set this thing up right, especially with the ramming in the game now, it could be so fun. And considering how meta heavy tanks are, and this is one of the heaviest medium tanks, it's got to go up in that list. All right, let's talk about the Leopard. This thing's fast, it's furious, it's got an incredible sniping gun, it's tons of fun. For the incredible players out there, I would put this thing higher up the list. For the casual players out there, they're still going to suffer because they're going to sit at the back of the map and not realize when it's time to get stuck into the game. So it's a toss-up between the great performers and the decent choices section. I'm going to have to put it in the decent choices section because while this tank is great for those people who know how to use it, I also despise seeing the casual players sniping at the back of the map, getting their 1,600 damage while the rest of the whole of the team is dying, and then questioning why they lost the game. It's because they didn't get involved. They didn't play the vehicle how it's meant to be played, which, at least in my opinion, I'm testing it out recently, is more of a control sniper with great camo to be able to then push the tempo after it whittles down its opponents at decent distances. Next, let's talk about the Italian auto-reloading medium tank, the Progetto 65. I personally love this tank, but I will admit, with the nerfs that I think have happened since a couple of years ago, this tank is not as competitive as it used to be. I guess the meme is like, lol, QB's playing the Progetto in 2021. I think it's still a fun tank, but I don't think it's fair to put it in the great performers section, even though I think that if you know how to play Italian auto-reloaders, it is a great performer. I'm going to put it in either the alright situational decent choices. It's not fair to put in the alright situational because I love this tank, so I'm going to put it in the decent choices section. You can't really go too wrong if you know how to play an auto-reloader, being able to have all of the benefits of the single shot, and then all of the benefits of being able to dump out the mag. The problem with the vehicle is its DPM just holds it back from being great. And these days there are just more and more competitive heavy tanks just grinding ridge lines that stop it from being able to control those locations and making good trades. I'd say this tank also really suffered with the artillery nerfs because while the heavy tanks don't get damaged so much, the Progetto 65 is losing all of its hit points whenever it gets hit. Okay, so now let's talk about the Japanese medium tank, the STB-1. This thing is very competitive. I have no idea why Wargaming buffed this thing to have, is it 12 or 14 degrees of gun depression inside the game, albeit when you're using the hydro pneumatic suspension. It's so bizarre to me that I really don't do well in this tank compared to a lot of vehicles. Maybe that's because I'm too aggressive. Maybe I don't sit there and I play that kind of ridgeline boring role like I should, and I guess I kind of can play that style in something like a Kranvagn. Some people will want to see this going up in the godlike section. Other players will want to see it going into the super competitive section. I can't put it in the godlike because I don't think it is, at least for me, but maybe I just suck in this tank. The thing that's stopping me from putting this into the godlike section is the 35mm of side armor. You might be thinking, what? Why because of the 35mm of side armor? Well, that's because there are so many 120mm caliber autoloaders. I'm looking at you, Kranvagn, I'm looking at you, Super Conqueror, I'm looking at you, VZ-55, I'm even looking at you, 50B. And when those tanks, or any of the other vehicles that have a 120mm caliber gun, know about the STB-1, and then they shoot it in the tracks, they can actually overmatch the whole of the side of the tank while taking the tracks off, and from that perspective it's incredibly frustrating to play. That's something that I can do in my heavy tanks and not have to worry about that I have to about the STB-1. And while this is undoubtedly a very competitive tank in the game, I just can't quite put it up into the godlike section because of my enjoyment of the vehicle. Now let's talk about the CS63. This is exactly the same scenario for the STB-1, but I'm dumping it in the godlike section. I love this tank. It's the fastest medium tank in the game. It's got good upper hull armor, turret armor that is not perfect, especially against heat, but it is still decent enough. This is one of the most fun tanks in the game. And I think if any medium is going to go up in there, at least from my perspective, it has to be this one. I just love racing into a position, having the DPM to be able to dominate my way out of it, having the mobility to run away from anything that is possible that could even dream of getting up to me, apart from like an EBR 105. But you know what? If it is an EBR 105, you know I am doing a 180 turn and ramming that EBR 105 and overpowering them, as I have usually about 50% more damage per minute than they will. The CS63, the only thing that sucks about this tank is that after you play it for a while, everything else feels boring. That's why I'm putting in the godlike section, because it's incomparable to anything else. It's just so darn fun. And I would thoroughly recommend the advanced and the above players. If you haven't got this, you owe it to yourself to get this tank. But for the casual players out there, maybe leave this one until you've got a little bit more confidence in the game. Now let's talk about the UDES 1516. I mean, it's great from sitting on a ridge line and grinding out your opponents, a bit like an STB-1. But I just can't seem to enjoy this vehicle that much. The things that I hate about the tank are the lack of APCR rounds on your standard, your poor heat penetration. And when I said lack of APCR rounds as standard, I'm not making a mistake there. It's because they have 1,000 meters a second shell velocity. And the reason why people enjoy APCR is because, of course, they're known for having a better shell velocity. So this actually makes them inferior to armor-piercing rounds that quite often have that shell velocity or better. The other thing that I hate about the UDES is that while its turret armor is good, most people are loading gold rounds and firing up towards the top, and it's just so darn frustrating when those rounds go in. Sure, it's only going to happen half the time if they've got 310 millimeters of pen, but let's say, for example, you're fighting against a 121 that's YOLOing in those heat rounds to your turret. Now they got an 83% chance to be able to go through your entire turret, and when this game is just so different between whether they fire gold at you and whether they don't fire gold at you, that means that you can't make consistent plays, and for that the vehicle is just so darn frustrating for me. But I have to admit it's also a good tank as well, so I'm going to be putting it in the great performers section. So with the STB1 and the UDES, you could argue that both of those should go up a tier, but this is just my personal preference, that I just don't enjoy the vehicles, and maybe if you're anything like me, you might not enjoy them as much as other tanks as well. Now let's talk about the Centurion Action 10. I'm going to put this thing either in the alright situation or avoid section. I think I've got to put it in the avoid section, which pains me considering it is a British vehicle. The reason why I'm putting it here is that while it can do well on a ridgeline, it's got 410 meters view range, which means that it doesn't need to use coated optics. Its turret armor just doesn't hold up to high explosive anti-tank rounds, a lot like on the UDES, which is what most people fire, and the vehicle's just so big and its hull is so mediocre that there are other sleeker, faster tanks, I'm looking at you CS63, that have comparable DPM, that have kind of more usable armor, at least in a variety of scenarios, and just don't have such an awful huge hull that feels like a lumbering donkey around the battlefield. I'm sorry, Centurion Action 10, that I'm having to put you there. Alright, now let's talk about the M48A5 Patton. This is my most played tank, so I should know about it, right? I really enjoy this tank. I would want to put it up towards the great performer section, but even I have to admit that it's not that great of a performer these days. When people set this thing up correctly, as hopefully you've seen in my masterclass video on the tank, I think it's a decent choice, and I'm going to leave it there as well. I don't think I can put it up into the great performers section along with the 50M and the TVP and so on and so forth, but I think it's a decent choice, a lot like the other medium tanks that I have put in here. This vehicle, with the field mods and with equipment, can actually get fast enough to start to contest those locations. And just like with the T110E5, which I put into the decent choices, its hull armor is really usable and can seriously surprise your opponent if you just over-angle, sit in front of them, and just go to town with your decent DPM. Another thing that I love about this tank is the 420 meters view range gives you just so much flexibility with the field mods and with the equipment, again, as I showed in my masterclass video. Go and check it out. See if you like it. See if it's a good one. And maybe you'll find the M48 is an enjoyable tank. For the seriously casual players out there, this thing's such an all-rounder that I still don't think it'll be a disaster if you get it. But I'd probably drop it down a couple of notches. Now let's talk about the M60. This vehicle costs bonds, and I hate it. And that is because it feels like it's the child of an M48 and a Leopard that just doesn't have any of the fun. It doesn't have the armor of the M48. It doesn't have the sniping capacity of the Leopard. And I think since the Leopard has been significantly buffed, I just can't really bring myself to enjoy the M60. Even though this thing has been buffed, it has the worst of the win ratios of any of the reward medium tanks. And it's not even doing that much damage considering it's meant to be one of the better snipers. I hate this tank. I bought it. I wanted to love it. I thought it was going to be great. But every time I play it, I just get disappointed with its armor performance. It's terrible camo rating, horrific camo rating, and huge weak point on top. I would thoroughly recommend avoiding it. Now let's talk about the T22, a vehicle which I bought in the black market last year. So this will be the first time that I am talking about this tank. I spent 77 million credits on this tank. I could have bought myself 11 or 12 other premium vehicles, or I could have bought myself 35 crew books and got myself 35 crews with brothers in arms on my other tanks. But I have a tank which I've barely played. I probably played it about 50 times over the last year. It's definitely not bad. The incredible thing about the tank is that you can be able to over-angle the side armor, and you can just laugh as your opponents just bounce off you. Take a look at this. Look how this thing's armored. It's just a big V. It's just a V. And what happens when you got V-shaped armor? Yeah, you can just sit there, and most donkeys aren't going to know how to deal with it as they just bounce off your side armor, even when it's angled as much as this. But the problem is that the other statistics of the vehicle just feel so lackluster. The gun handling, the accuracy, the DPM, none of that really just absolutely shines. And while it's undoubtedly a solid vehicle, it just feels as if there are kind of better, almost, I'm going to say it, more fun medium tanks in the game. I'm going to have to dump this thing in the great performers section. I want to dump it down into the avoid section. Let's say it comes up in the black market again next year. I think the cheapest you could have got this tank for was, I think, about 45 million on the European server. Was it worth that? No, it wasn't. To get 45 million credits, even if you're a great player playing tier 8 premium tanks with a credit booster at Christmas time, you have to play for 45 hours. Was this tank worth 45 hours of my life? Hell no, it really wasn't worth 45 hours of my life. Although when I look at other games like World of Warcraft, I've spent hundreds of hours to just get a single item that gets replaced in about 6 months or a year. From that perspective, at least the T22 is still sitting in my garage. Still not worth the grind. Now let's talk about the K91. A lot of people absolutely hate this tank. However, I think that they just don't know how to play it, as I showed in my masterclass video. I honestly think if you set this thing up correctly, it is a great performer. But I don't think I can put it up there, because I think for the casual players, it's going to be more of an alright situational avoid. I think I'm going to balance it out by putting it in the decent choices section. But that will cater for all of the players, right? If you're very casual and you don't want to go and watch my masterclass video, or maybe just game mechanics confuse you, then this is going to be a bad tank for you. You're not going to have the alpha damage or the armor or the flexible turret to be able to really make use of all of the vehicle's strengths, which is the camo rating and the rate of fire. But again, if you set the vehicle up correctly, you definitely are going to have those statistics, and this is going to be one of the more competitive medium tanks in the game. Every time I've played this thing since I set it up, how I did in my masterclass video, I have absolutely loved this tank, just controlling the engagement at long range. And I don't think I've had like a seriously bad game in it since. It's an absolute performer, and I think it's a severely underrated tank. All right, so now I'm going to be playing in the Object 430, or I'm not going to be playing in the Object 430, but I'm going to be talking about the Object 430. This is still just a great tank. It's just the all-purpose killing machine. It's got absolutely rock-solid armor that, yeah, it does fall a little bit against heat, but if you're using some of your gun depression, your angling, you know, if you just wiggle, it's just got that kind of idiot-proof armor that is absolutely wonderful. Combine that with decent alpha damage, 122mm caliber gun that will overmatch tanks, and the 122mm is just an absolute performer on this tank. The 430U definitely is not in the same caliber as it used to be. So much so that Wargaming have nerfed it in the last couple of years. I'm still going to be dumping it in the decent choices section, even though I kind of want to put it up in the great performers section personally. I think it's you can't go wrong with an Object 430U. It's a great first tank to have inside the game, and any player can play it and they'll do well. Next up, let's talk about the T62A. This pains me. This was the original tier 10 medium tank for the Soviet nation, but it's just been surpassed by everything. I'm gonna have to put this in the avoid section. I'm not gonna put in the I hate it section, even though it does have a similar playstyle to the 121B and the 121. The very idea that you would ever play this thing if you have a 121B or a 121 or even a 430 or even a 140 is kind of laughable. All of the other tanks have just got better, and unfortunately it's the tank that time forgot. But that still doesn't mean that if you're sitting in a ridgeline and you're only exposing that turret, you still can't do well in the vehicle. Now let's talk about its main competitor, the Object 140. This vehicle now has 2 degrees gun depression better than it. It now has better hull armor, and its turret armor, since they made the changes on it, is pretty much the same, although maybe a little bit worse than the T62A. The 140 is just an all-round tank. The problem is that a lot of the other tanks are also becoming all-round tanks. This tank will YOLO between the great performers and the decent choices section. I think I've got to personally put it in the decent choices section, and that is just because I kind of forgot about this tank. There are just so many other flavors of ice cream in World of Tanks that I've kind of forgotten for my love of vanilla, which the 140 is. It's just this all-purpose machine. You can't go wrong with the vehicle. But I look at the whole of this list and my eyes are pretty much attracted to all of the other vehicles for all of their other attributes, for which the Object 140, it can't match them in their best characteristic, but also none of them can actually match how holistically awesome the 140 is. So it's a decent choice. You can't go wrong with this vehicle, but I think that there are more exciting tanks to play in World of Tanks these days. Alright, so those were all of the medium tanks. Now let's move on to the tank destroyers. First up, let's talk about the tank that nobody really talks about. This is the WZ-113G. It, I believe, is the least played tier 10 tank. Nobody bothers to grind up the Chinese tech tree, and I can understand why. Because there's an Object 268 version 4 in the game, which pretty much does everything that this tank does, but arguably a little bit more fun and a little bit better. Nevertheless, the WZ-113, I'm not going to put it in the avoid section because honestly, it's a competitive tank. You've got a great selection of ammunition, which you are far more flexible with these days with intuition on the tank. The tank's pretty fast, equipment 2.0, and the field mods have allowed you to be able to customize the vehicle to be able to suit its strengths, which is aggression and playing as an assault tank. And if you can hide that lower plate and you avoid the kind of the cheek armor that this vehicle has, that when you angle becomes a real big weak point, then it's decent. Every time I play this vehicle, which is very seldomly, because usually I'm either forgetting about it or people aren't voting for it in the tank poll, I'm pleasantly surprised. Nevertheless, it's a forgettable tank still that I can imagine that not too many people are going to be playing in 2021. All right, so now let's talk about the two French tank destroyers. The WZ-111 was the tank I previously talked about. We're talking about the Foch 155, yeah, with the 155mm. I want to put it in the avoid section. Can be alright and situational. Oh, I also want to put it in the I hate it section because it just really feels so frustrating. This thing has 750 alpha damage, a 3-round magazine, and takes 50 seconds to reload. The problem with the tank is that I would like it if I could fire one and then reload, fire one and then reload, for example. Honestly, this tank, if Wargaming were to want to change it and they were to give it, say, an auto reloader instead, could kind of actually be really fun. Just the way that it is now, I despise playing this tank. I fire one shot, I miss. Now what do? Do I reload for 40 seconds, or do I actually just wait and then only have 2 shots that maybe is not going to be enough to be able to handle the situation? I can't stand it. I feel like it's a real awful gameplay, but I'm still going to have to put it in the alright and situational section, because even I have to admit that if you play this thing carefully, it can still be a bit of a beast. I'm going to put the Foch B in the same section. Part of me wants to put it in the decent choices, because whenever I play this tank, I manage to just clap everything in front of me. The problem with the tank is that it has awful penetration, unlike its Foch 155 brother. And while some people will enjoy this auto-loading tank destroyer gameplay, I personally just don't think it's that fun of a tank. And I also think this is really bad tank design. There shouldn't be a tank that can deal 2,400 damage in 10 seconds. It's basically a WT Alfie 100. I guess the difference is that this thing doesn't have a turret like the WT Alfie 100 used to have, which definitely balances this one out compared to the disgusting, game-breaking German TD. Next up, the Grille. This vehicle is just a nice sniping platform, really. The problem with the tank is its armor is very lackluster, and while its gun is undoubtedly excellent, it's not nearly as good as it was before it was nerfed. I feel like this vehicle needs to go into the decent choices, the alright situational section. Do you think I would have been able to learn how to say that word after saying it so many times in this video? And still to this day, it is a fan favorite, and people are still constantly playing it. All right, now let's talk about the Jagdpanzer E100, a tank that has the highest penetration in the game with 420 high explosive anti-tank rounds. Honestly, Equipment 2.0 has probably benefited this tank more than any of the other tank destroyers, apart from arguably the next one that we're going to be talking about. I think it's either got a yo-yo between the great performers or the decent choices section. I can't believe I'm thinking about doing this, but I'm probably going to put it in the great performers section. Since artillery was nerfed, tanks with armor, like the Jagdpanzer E100, have been doing better than ever. And since Equipment 2.0 and the field mods, slow tanks like the Jagdpanzer E100 have been doing better than ever as well. This tank is a solid behemoth that you can go to, and it really doesn't matter what kind of a player you are. The casual players are going to giggle as they do 1,000 damage, either from the back of the map or maybe just pushing in against a heavy tank. And the great players are going to sit there clinging on to dear life, bouncing at least occasionally, or at least out trading their opponents and laughing as they butter their way through the front of even the godlike tank's turret armor with its 420 high explosive. It's a decent tank, irrelevant of what kind of a player you are in World of Tanks these days. Now let's talk about the Stridsvagn 103B. I love this tank. I think it has a real fun playstyle, and just like with the Jagdpanzer, Equipment 2.0 and the field mods have really helped this thing out. Now you can pump up the view range to a point where you don't need binoculars once you've got the field mod equipped, once you've got that scouting slot as well. And so that allows you to use coated optics with a turbo, probably with either a gun rammer or vents on this tank to really have better performance than ever. This tank with a turbocharger, if you were to use a Bond one, can now go at 16 kilometers an hour forwards and 14 backwards. That's outrageous. This thing kind of goes as quickly as the T95 and the TOG used to go before they were buffed inside the siege mode. But inside the siege mode, it's just the best snipey, best damage dealing tank, even better than the Badger and the Tortoise from that regard. I'm going to put this thing in the great performers section, but I'd like to add a caveat that if you're a very casual player, while you're probably still going to do some damage at the back of the map, you're not going to do very well in it. The players who do well in this tank will be the ones who know how to take the Stridsvagn 103B out aggressively against its opponents and sit there, laugh, while those hopefully 120mm caliber guns bounce off your armor and you rip them apart with the third best DPM in the game. Now let's talk about the FV215B 183. I'm going to put this in the decent choices section because its armor makes it more relevant than the British brother that we're going to be talking about in a second. I would like to drop it further down the list due to the fact that to be able to get this tank now, I think it's something stupid like 20 million credits to be able to get your hands on it when the black market comes out. But I don't think it's fair to drop it further down the list because with the armor piercing rounds or the high explosive the high explosive squashed head rounds, it's still a great tank. And intuition, we're going to have an intuition counter on this video, allows you to be so much more flexible with your rounds than you previously could be. And unlike the 4005, where you feel that the armor is just a big hindrance, this thing actually can tank a shot occasionally. Considering how important armor is in the game right now, I'm going to be slapping the FV in that decent choices section. Now let's talk about the FV405. I would either put this thing in the alright situational or avoid section. Since the nerfs, which I'd like to say Wargaming, I'm very happy that you did nerf this tank, combined with the high explosive nerfs to this vehicle, it just feels as if it's not really worth playing like it used to be. In fact, I'm going to put it in the I hate it section, and I'm going to tell you why. This is because obviously I'm a performer on the internet and I shouldn't really allow this to cloud my judgment, so to say, but I feel like this is my list anyway. I'm going to put it in the I hate it section because you're so slow, you've got terrible armor, and everybody has real big expectations for this tank. Honestly, after you've played this thing for a while, you'll just go, when you one-shot someone. Sure, it can be sometimes funny, but it just feels as if that's your goal, how little times it happens and how often you just find yourself sitting there wasting thousands of credits, firing all of the Hesh rounds at your opponents and just waiting for your grisly demise. It is a depressing tank to play, boys and girls. I would thoroughly recommend not getting the FV4005 and maybe just watching like one of the awesome videos that I put out a month ago where you see one doing 14,000 damage. You're going to get more one-shots in watching that video than you probably would do in the entire play session in the FV405. I just think that it's in a real bad state. Another reason why this thing is in a bad state is because artillery now, this is one of the only tanks that they can reliably penetrate, and it still takes maximum damage from artillery, unlike all of the other vehicles which seem to be able to take less damage from arty. And so I'd say that you're in a real bad position against artillery in this tank as well. Now let's talk about the Badger, a frontal tank destroyer with the best damage per minute in the game. The Badger, a bit like a Jagdpanzer E100, has to go into the great performers section. I'd almost want to dump it up into the super competitive section, at least for me personally. And you know what? Seeing how this is my list, I'm going to dump it into the super competitive section. And do you know why? Because all of the vehicles that this tank tries to compete with just don't really seem to exist as much anymore. The artillery aren't punishing it. The flanking plays are starting to dwindle down. And it's mostly fighting against super heavy tanks, the hull down vehicles that you can all see towards the top of this list. And it has the clout to be able to carve through them. Honestly, if you set this thing up correctly, I would argue that it's one of, if not the best, tank destroyers in the game. Pumping up its DPM with its field mods, pumping up its DPM with equipment 2.0 while also maybe focusing on its mobility as well makes this thing able to actually reach the gunfight before it's already been concluded. And that makes this thing a lean, mean killing machine that if you're a good player, you will exceed in this tank massively. Okay, so now let's talk about the T110E3. This is basically like a Badger that just doesn't have as quite high of a skill cap, but that can actually help a lot of players. Some people don't really know how to use that wild rate of fire that the Badger has, and they will feel more comfortable with the 2 degrees less gun depression, but better alpha damage on the T110E3. For some players, it will be the superior vehicle, but I'd say for the advanced players, it's going to be the inferior vehicle. Nevertheless, there's no doubt that armor is more important in the game than ever, as we're seeing with this list. Notice how all of the lightly armored glass cannons are down here, and then you've got kind of all of these tanks with good guns in the middle, and then towards the top it's all of the hold down Metairie vehicles. And the T110E3 from that perspective will be a great performer for just grinding out tanks in front of it. And I just realized that was the T110E4. Well, I jumped the gun, I did the T110E3. Now I'm going to do the T110E4. This vehicle's a tough one. It suffers from its hybrid status. It's not quite a tank destroyer. It's not quite a heavy tank. It's somewhere in between. When we compare it to something like an E100, it has inferior armor for the same rate of fire, for better pen, with a big weak point on top, and it's kind of the same speed. It doesn't feel special from that regard. And when we compare it to a tank destroyer, well, it just doesn't have the rate of fire or the DPM that you really need to be dealing with your opponents. So from that perspective, I'm going to put it in the alright situational section. I can't put it up in the decent choices. But one thing that does rock on this tank is intuition. Intuition counter, please. And that's because you can switch out to the awesome HE rounds that this vehicle has, or switch out to that gold round and save yourself a bunch of credits. And the HE rounds on this tank, a lot like all of the other tank destroyers, have 1,100 or 1,150 alpha. I think it's 1,190 millimeters of high explosive pen, which is very usable indeed. All right, so now we're going to be looking at the Object 268 version 4. This is the best tank destroyer in the game. It still is. It always will be. It's just this absolute incredible tour de force. It's got everything that you need. Idiot-proof frontal armor, a weak point that isn't a weak point unless they're firing gold at you. It's fast, it's agile. Artillery aren't punishing it anymore. Equipment 2.0 and the field mods have allowed it to be even more aggressive than it ever was before. You can't track it now. It's faster. It's outrageous. This thing is an incredible tank, and you really can't go wrong with the 268 version 4. The only thing that I will say about this tank is because it's that darn good, I feel like when I play it, that I play it a little bit loose. And maybe I'm not willing to put in the effort and the time to actually give it the attention that it deserves. But sometimes that's a fun way to play World of Tanks, right? And there's a reason why it does have by far the best win ratio. We're talking about 1.5% better than any of the other tank destroyers. It's doing the most damage, it's getting the best win ratio, and I'm very surprised that it's not being played more. Bizarre that. I guess maybe it's because its playstyle just is a little mundane. I guess there's only so much holding down that W key that you can do and grinding out your opponents before it does get a little mundane. Alright, so now let's take a look at the Object 268. This thing used to have the best heat pen in the game at 450. These days, it just feels as if it's in no man's land. And I feel like the player base agree with me because it's got the worst win ratio of any of the tier 10 tank destroyers. And while from that perspective, I should probably put it in the avoid section, I'm not going to. I'm actually going to put this thing, personally, in the decent choices section. I think that it is a strong tank. And I think the main reason why it has this abysmal win ratio is because most people are doing the rational thing and getting the Object 268 version 4 instead, which leaves, shall we say, the ill-informed players picking the Object 268. But you can't really go wrong with this. It's accurate, it's got great DPM, it's got that full-blooded tier 10 tank destroyer gun, its camera rating is not bad, its view range is not good, but the mobility on this thing allows you to do outrageous things. As I showcased in my video that I released in September called The Original Boomstick, I have no idea why this vehicle isn't more popular and it doesn't have a better win ratio. Because whenever I play it, I'm clapping my opponents left, right, and center, and I think it has all of the statistics to be a decent performer. And so this, in my opinion, is one of my hidden gems of the tank destroyers. And I wish I could just have an extra day of the week to be able to play these more unpopular, kind of forgettable tanks and really show why they shine. All right, so those were all of the tank destroyers. Now we're going to be moving on to the light tanks. Firstly, the WZ-1321. I'm going to put this thing in the I hate it section. And do you know why? Because its armor is kind of irrelevant. From that perspective, I would like to put it in the alright situational section because it has the best turret armor of any of the tanks in the game. But every time I play this vehicle, I just get frustrated. It has okay combat potential with 390 alpha damage, and it's got an okay gun and all of this. It's like, okay. But at the end of the day, you're pretty much like a tier 9 medium tank trying to play in tier 10 matchmaking. And while with equipment 2.0 and the field modifications, you can switch out the builds, I really question why you would even decide to play this tank when you could play something like a K91 or a CS63 instead. I thoroughly would recommend avoiding this tank, and I'm going to put it in the I hate it section purely because it's just not a competitive light tank and it's not a competitive damage dealer, and that one in whatever games where you're going to feel all happy because you sat in a position with 5 degrees of gun depression, you ricocheted a few shells and you made that outplay. Ugh. It's not my thing, boys and girls. All right, now let's talk about the EBR 105. This is a controversial tank, and I think I have to be putting this up in either the super competitive or the godlike section. It would have gone into the godlike section a couple of years ago before the nerfs. Now with the nerfs, the fact that it has that less view range, the fact that it has the weaker wheels that slow down more whenever you get hit, and the fact that Wargaming butchered the penetration on its high explosive rounds, I don't really feel like I can put it into the super competitive section for all players. For the casual players now, it's probably going to drop down to decent choices, but I'm going to put it into super competitive because honestly, when you set this thing up with Bond equipment, when you have a real good crew with recon situational awareness, brothers in arms, and you're using a premium consumable, the list goes on and on and on, right? This thing is still absolutely god tier. And with the field mods that didn't benefit this tank as much as it might have benefited other tanks, it is still a super competitive tank for all of the decent players out there. If there's one thing I will say about this vehicle, however, it's that I have played hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of games in wheeled vehicles over the years. And so if I was just jumping into the wheeled vehicle meta now, don't be concerned immediately. Try and remain calm, try and think about what you're doing, and eventually you kind of reach this sweet spot with how you need to play them. And I still think it's a super competitive tank. Now let's talk about the 13105. This is a French light tank that likes to deal damage. And from that perspective, it's a great performer, or it's a decent choice because sure, it's got a 3-round magazine with more gun depression than the Batchat. And I would say that if this tank didn't lose so much penetration over distance, that it would probably be better than the Batchat for a lot of situations. The problem with the tank is that unlike the Batchat, it doesn't get great penetration and it loses a lot of it. But like all of the light tanks do, which really hampers it down. I'm going to be putting the tank in a decent choice or a great performers section. It's a tough one. I'm probably going to put it in the great performers because honestly, when it comes to dealing damage, this thing still absolutely claps for me. The problem with the tank is that there are a lot of other medium tanks that also kind of absolutely clap their opponents. And with the case of the TVP, which has more view range and a bigger magazine, yeah, it definitely hampers on making this thing go up into the super competitive section. All right, now let's talk about the Rheinmetall Pzw, which has the worst win ratio of any tier 10 tank in the game. And for that, I have to put it in the avoid section. I'm not going to put it in the I hate it section, and I'm going to let you know why. Because at least this tank has some soul, I think, unlike the WZ-1321, at least for me. The Rheinmetall Pzw is the vehicle that I go to when I want to give myself a challenge. However, unless you're a World of Tanks masochist like me, yeah, you should definitely avoid this thing completely. This has one of, if not my lowest win ratios of any of my tier 10 tanks, and I feel that it's the tank that I probably couldn't be able to get to a decent level even if I was trying as hard as I could. Nevertheless, as I showed with a video about a couple of months ago on the channel, making the worst tier 10 actually good, with the right kind of equipment on this vehicle, it can actually be, can't believe I'm going to say this, okay. But considering that you're a big, fat, easy to spot light tank, that when it does get spotted by pesky things like the EBR 105 whizzing around it, they clap it with HE again and again and again and again and again, and it makes me want to cry inside. Yeah, there are definitely better tanks, and this is one I would avoid. Okay, now let's talk about the Manticore. This is an interesting tank because when this vehicle first went into the game, I thought that it was going to be absolutely useless. And I guess I was wrong, because the Manticore is sitting there with the best win ratio. But it's weird because the Manticore is not even close to being one of the most played tanks. And I talked about this on a video once again a couple of months ago, and that is that it's doing well because its camera rating is so outrageously good, and with equipment 2.0 and with the field modifications, you can get this thing up to like 55% concealment, and so it pretty much is the bush. And from that perspective, it should be doing a lot of spotting, while also still controlling the engagement against its opponents. And as I mentioned in that video, quite a complicated thing to try and fit into this one to stop it from being an hour and a half. But basically, the rate of fire on the Manticore doesn't hold it back as much as I nearly thought it was. Sure, this tank still gets annihilated if it gets caught in an all-in engagement, but quite often you're popping up, firing a shot, and then you've got to hide for about 15 seconds, which is the reload on this tank anyway, to be able to deliver another one. I'm personally not going to put this thing in the godlike section because there are still a couple of things that incredibly frustrate me about the tank. That is the gun elevation, and also that is the lack of ammunition. But there's no doubt that this is about as good as it gets when it comes to light tanks in World of Tanks. Alright, so now let's talk about the Sheridan. I'm going to be dropping this one in the avoid section, because, I don't know, it still feels as if there's at least a kind of a reason to play it. If you play this thing with the 105mm, you have the highest DPM of any light tank in the game. Exciting, right? If you play this thing with the 150mm caliber gun, you have one of the most funny light tanks in the game that some people are still going to laugh, and with intuition, at least you're going to be able to switch out those shells. But there's no doubt that it is horrendous when it comes to being competitive. And I had a play session in this tank where I tried as hard as I could, and there's a reason why these vehicles like the Manticore and the EBR are up here, and that's because they can actually scout. Who would have thought, if a tank has 10% base better camo rating, that it's going to be able to scout better than something like a Sheridan, which is a fat, lumbering tank. The Sheridan has pretty much the same kind of camo rating as a K91 or a CS63, but is just inferior in every single other way. So I would definitely never recommend this vehicle. You get matched up against more competitive tanks and you're going to cry because of it. Now let's talk about the T100LT. I love this tank. I absolutely love this tank. It's a toss-up for me whether it goes into the godlike or the super competitive section. And I'm going to put it in the godlike section. I honestly think it's better than the EBR and the Manticore, and it's one of my favorite picks for absolutely dominating your games. Now, why is that? Because it's just this absolute amazing mix match of some armor that will occasionally be able to get you out of trouble, a low profile which gives it incredible camo rating, incredible gun handling so you never have to worry about using vertical stabilizers on the tank, and while the ammunition definitely lets the tank down, this tank can scout, this tank can brawl, this tank can motor, it can absolutely tear it around. And another thing I'd like to mention is that because the vehicle's power to weight ratio is so outrageously good, this gives you lots of flexibility with the vehicle's field mods, like lowering that engine power a little bit to be able to get a little bit better top speed. A vehicle like this, I'm a bit of a weirdo. I would probably go for the DPM on this tank because I'm often fighting in close quarters combat. And the fact that in ranked, you're either getting matched up against Manticores or all of the casual players playing the not very competitive light tanks. Yeah, this thing is an absolute beast, and I'm going to put it as my only light tank that's in the godlike section just from my personal preferences, as I have this thing on my free-to-play account, I have this thing on my main account, and for me, I adore it. I'd like to add a final caveat here. that all three of the light tanks that I just talked about that are in the godlike and the super competitive section, they could go in between these depending on what your kind of vibe is and what your kind of play style is for that given occasion. This is just how I'm feeling right now with the meta on the game. Okay, now let's talk about self-propelled guns. And spoilers, I'm going to put all of them into the avoid section. Let me try and explain why. Wargaming have made self-propelled guns a non-class in World of Tanks. Why did they nerf something that already wasn't very competitive in the game? Now they feel as if they're doing paltry amounts of damage, which they actually are. They're averaging like 1,000 damage per game. They're averaging half a frag per game. And that's bizarre when you think that you should be averaging at least 1 frag per game, right? And they feel like one of the most depressing and fruitless and pointless things to actually do inside World of Tanks. The only time I'll play artillery is when they've been voted for, or alternatively, if I need to have a snack, I'll sit there one-handed, I'll click there, and then I'll eat some food. That's it. That's what the class is there for me. It's actually a real depressing state for the game. Because, believe it or not, I feel that artillery are kind of healthy for the matchmaker. They're holding back these godlike tanks from being godlike. Do you notice how important gun depression, and do you notice how important autoloaders and hull armor is, turret armor, is in the game right now? A lot of these vehicles have always been good inside the game. But the fact that now there are less and less self-propelled guns playing mean that the super heavies are, it's basically the meta inside World of Tanks right now. And while I would argue it's not the end of the world in the random queue, at least when it comes to ranked right now, I am not looking forward to playing the next season of ranked. That's just my 2 cents. So let me talk briefly about the self-propelled guns. Batchat 15558. I mean, it's good at shooting softly armored targets, and it's good because it's accurate and it can consistently stun tanks. And if you can use that to be able to stun a tank just before your useful tanks on your team are actually going to dive in and harvest it, then that's a way that you can actually manage to get something from it. It still feels just absolutely pointless to even bother playing it. I'd probably do more if I was to drive round with a Foch 155, probably firing HE. GWE 100, this vehicle is a mixed match between a T92 and something like a Conqueror gun carriage. It's got a pretty nice gun arc. It claps. It's got some armor that control occasionally. I guess it can be quite funny when idiots try to ram you as well rather than just shoot you, but okay. The Conqueror gun carriage, I'd say this is the best of the self-propelled guns because it can loop its shells over and just do real big splash. And considering how Wargaming have made it so that the self-propelled gun class is now not so much of a damage dealer but a support tank, the amount of times that you can clap multiple vehicles and stun them to enable your allies to be able to engage them definitely makes this one of the better ones. The T92, this vehicle it doesn't perform well unless it's on an open map, and then I'd say it's probably actually one of the most damaging self-propelled guns. The thing that holds the T92 back is that when you get on a map like Himmelsdorf or Ensk, it just feels absolutely useless because its shells are fairly direct fire. And the same thing can be said about the T92, although I'd say the T92 is better. Not the T92, sorry, the Object 216. It has that kind of direct fire shell, which makes it very accurate indeed. The problem is its shells just don't feel like they actually have the damage to be able to deal with heavily armored targets, and it kind of results in being this kind of a stunny thing. And there's probably a reason why self-propelled guns have a complete average win ratio with hardly any disparity between them, with hardly any damage disparity apart from the Batchat 15558, because they're all just as lackluster as each other. And I feel like Wargaming have lobotomized the class to being just a pointless thing to play. And I don't even know why self-propelled gun players even bother with it anymore, to be honest. Which is kind of a depressing thing, because I genuinely think that having at least about one self-propelled gun in the game in its previous form was actually kind of good for the meta, and stopping certain tanks from sitting on the ridgeline and just grinding it out. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, that was my tier 10 tier list for 2021. Really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, however, give it a thumbs down. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of comments down below with whether you agree or disagree about where I have put certain vehicles. And I must say a massive thank you to all of you for your awesome feedback on my rating all of the tier 8 premium tanks. I said that if I got 8,000 likes that I would do this before the end of the year, and you've all backed me up and given me some awesome feedback on that video to let me know that you wanted to see this one for 2021. And a final mention should be made to the fact that yes, I didn't talk about the Clan Wars tanks inside this tier list. That's because I don't have them. And I decided this year that it wasn't really right if I talked about tanks that I didn't have. I think you can probably guess where they're all going to be, and spoilers, most of them are not down at the bottom. If you have to pick one from a campaign, of course you're going to pick the Chieftain. If you're going to pick another one, of course you're going to pick the Object 907. After that, it's probably going to be a toss-up between the Caro and the VK 7201. So hopefully that helps all of you Clan Wars players out there. Anyway, congratulations to you if you made it towards the end of this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.